When we think about leaders and governing authorities around the world, I think many would conclude that there are probably more bad leaders than good leaders these days. Many leaders make decisions based on politics and what's favorable to their party's agenda, rather than what's truly good for the people. We've also seen countless examples of corruption, bribery, criminal behavior, fraud and embezzlement, harassment, selfishness, violence, or just plain incompetence in our leaders today. And yet every few years, leaders come and go, for the most part, and bring a whole new wave of issues, broken promises, unpopular policies, and so on. So how are we as Christians to engage with our leaders, whether we like them or not? Romans 13, 1 through 7 gives us a good framework for how we should think and live in regards to leaders and authorities. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. There is some debate about the original context of this passage, whether Paul was describing Roman synagogue leadership or more broadly talking about local and national government authorities. Regardless, we can apply some principles to guide our attitudes towards our leaders and authorities, whether they are religious leaders, leaders in the workplace, or government leaders. Paul is writing in a time where the Roman government was not what we would consider good. The authorities were hostile towards the Christian faith and were persecuting Christians. Paul himself was the recipient of mistreatment by government authorities, having been beaten and put in prison. So Paul isn't telling us that if the government or leaders are good and aligned with Christian values, then we should submit to the authorities. But even under the Roman rule, or wherever you live today, even if, or especially if, the authorities are evil or corrupt, be subject to the governing authorities regardless. Why? Verse 1 tells us, because there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Ultimately, God is the true authority, and he is in control. We submit to our human authorities out of obedience to our heavenly authority so that we can be the salt and light of the world. As with many values of our God and our Christian faith, followers of Jesus are countercultural. We know this through the life and teachings of Jesus, who embodied this during his time on earth. He forgave his enemies. He spent time with the outcast and the marginalized. He did not overthrow the Roman government that put him through unfair trials, beat him, and crucified him, even though he had the power to call down armies of angels. He subjected himself to the evil authorities out of obedience to the Father. Our passage comes immediately after chapter 12, where Paul writes things like, in verse 14, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Or verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Or chapter 12, verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So yes, this passage is difficult, especially when we find ourselves under the authority of leaders who are evil, who are corrupt, or difficult to respect, and especially are counter to our faith and values. Yet still, we are not to resist authority, in verse 2, be good citizens, verse 3, and pay our dues and respect even to our oppressors, verse 7 in chapter 13. If you look at Acts 23, we see an interesting situation. Starting in verse 2, and the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck." Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" The high priest, Ananias, one example of an authority, is clearly abusing his position and mistreating Paul. Yet after criticizing Ananias and realizing that he is the high priest, Paul concludes that he did wrong by dishonoring the office of the authority, even if the character of the authority was out of line. N.T. Wright, in his book, Paul for Everyone on the Book of Romans, writes, "Christians who were regarded as the scum of the earth in Rome at the time must not get an additional reputation as troublemakers. No goodwill comes to the cause of the gospel by followers of Jesus being regarded as crazy dissidents who won't cooperate with the most basic social mechanisms. Paul is anxious precisely because he believes that Jesus is the true Lord of the world, that his followers should not pick unnecessary quarrels with the lesser lords. They are indeed a revolutionary community, but if they go for the normal type of violent revolution, they will just be playing the empire back at its own game. They will almost certainly lose, and much worse, the gospel itself will lose with them." I do want to say clearly that Paul is not telling us to ignore or condone the sin of our leaders and authorities. Looking back again to chapter 12, he writes in verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." We surely need wisdom and discernment. How do we live in a world that embodies values so contrary to ours as Christians, with leaders in government, in the workplace, and even in our churches sometimes, who are not respectable, good, or godly? We continue to submit ourselves to God and submit ourselves to the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit in us to be transformed by the renewal of our minds so that we know better and better the character, values, and will of our God. Will there be situations where submission and obedience is not possible, and as Christians we need to disobey and resist human authority for the sake of obeying God's authority? Absolutely. But Paul is telling us that that should not be the norm and general practice, but rather the exception. And in our developed wisdom, discernment, and maturity of faith, we have work to do to determine if and when that's necessary. But overall, the message is clear. Followers of Christ should show respect and honor to the authorities, embody humility and obedience, pray for our leaders, and promote peace. We have a simple and clear purpose that drives everything that we do as followers of Christ, which is to love God and to love others. And everything we do should flow from that.